Hi guys. So, new year, new unit. We are starting off with the Renaissance. So, in the first semester, we went through kind of all of the elements and principles of the different kinds of arts. We talked about visual art, architecture, sculpture, music, dance, and theater. And now we're going to take all of those principles that we learned and we're going to apply them to different periods of European art history. Okay, so that's very important to realize that we are only talking about European art the rest of this semester. There's all kinds of wonderful art that exists in all the other cultures throughout history in Asia, in Africa, South America, North America, but we are going to be focusing almost exclusively on European art, especially for the Renaissance. So what is it? What's the Renaissance? It began in Italy around 1350, and it was characterized by a renewed interest in the past. So why did it occur? Why in 1350? So during the 11th and 12th centuries, so that's the 1000s and the 1100s, Europe benefited from a warmer climate. So what does that have to do with art? The warmth meant that there were more prosperous crops. Crops grew bigger and faster, which meant that people got wealthier. Okay, so people were able to turn those bigger crops into money. That developed an elite class. So instead of everybody being kind of working class, now there were a higher class economically. And then they had to work less. That meant that they had downtime, they had leisure time, and they began to use that time to become more educated, reading books, talking to people, and then they studied the past and then turned that into art. So the humanists, these are humanists were a big part of the Renaissance. So the humanist philosophy developed out of the study and focus on the past. So they studied how to lead a proper life according to the literature of the ancient Greeks and Romans. So now the people had this downtime, they were able to learn Latin, they were able to learn Greek, and they were reading texts left to us by the ancient Greek and Roman cultures. And they were like, this is how to lead a great life. So let's start doing that. So they emphasized the study of grammar, poetry, rhetoric, and history through those classical texts, so things written by Romans and Greeks. These subjects were collectively called the humanities because they were what made us human, separated us from the animals. So what did those humanists believe? They, studying the classical texts, led humanists to believe that it was important to learn how things worked, to emphasize education, to lead a meaningful life, and financially support the arts. So they celebrated both life and the afterlife. So that's why in a lot of the paintings that we're going to look at, they focus on heaven and hell. So the Italian Renaissance, that's where it all started. So new techniques that developed during the Italian Renaissance. The fresco. So this is a painting done on fresh, wet plaster with water-based paint. So this had to be done very quickly because once the plaster dried, you couldn't paint on it anymore. So some of the biggest examples are Sistine Chapel, the Sistine ceiling. We're going to talk about this a lot later on. So this was the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo. Other new techniques were perspective. This seems super obvious to us now, but this really didn't exist before the Renaissance. This is the organization of space and light with geometry. It creates the appearance of three dimensions on a flat surface. So if you look, this is the Last Supper painting by Leonardo da Vinci. You can see that it appears, you can see the three dimensions in the painting. You can see that there is space behind the people at that table. That didn't exist before. So if you look here, this is what paintings looked like before. They had no idea how to make people look three-dimensional. They all kind of looked flat and kind of smushed in. They didn't know how to show depth behind figures. All right, another new technique was focusing on human anatomy and movement. So emphasizing realistic portrayals of human beings as they moved. So if we go back to this painting before, you can see everyone's just standing still because they didn't know how to paint people moving. And then when we go to this Da Vinci painting, we see people in different poses because they have now figured out how to portray the human form in motion instead of just standing still. So that sketch is called The Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci. Then we have sculpture. Sculpture became popular again just as it was during ancient Greece and Rome. So there was kind of a dark age period where no sculpture was happening after the fall of the Roman Empire until the Renaissance. So sculpture, again, helped to emphasize this new focus on the realistic human form. So we're going to talk a lot about this soon. This is the Statue of David by Michelangelo. Architecture was also emphasized and used to show the importance of art in everyday life. So architecture shows that art can also serve a functional human need of shelter. Became very popular when building churches. There was a philosophy during this time that talked about how you showed your appreciation for God by building a bigger, nicer, flashier temple. So lots of focus went into building huge cathedrals like this. This is the Florence Cathedral, designed by Brunelleschi. Arts and patronage. So a patron is someone who financially sponsors a piece of art. Italians were willing to spend lots of money to patronize the arts. Arts communicated their social, political, and spiritual values to the world. So it was a status symbol. Like if you were able to afford to have this sculptor sculpt you a sculpture, if you were able to have this painter paint you a family portrait, it showed your status in society. Public art in Florence, Italy became organized in guilds. It became a means of social and political competition. The more art and artists you patronized, the higher your social status. So you wanted to be the one who paid the most. So the biggest patron of art during the Renaissance was the Medici family. The Medici family were prominent political social figures for over 4 centuries in Italy and are often credited with helping the high Renaissance to prosper. They patronized artists such as Michelangelo, Botticelli, Da Vinci, and Raphael, among many others. So in the Medici family, they married into royal families. They had popes, bishops, all kinds of, they had their fingers in many pots. So the masters of the high Renaissance, we are going to be talking a lot specifically about these 4 artists. So we have Donatello, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Do those names sound familiar? They're also the Ninja Turtles. May not be as exciting for you if you weren't a 90s kid, which none of you are, but okay. So when you are looking at Renaissance art, there are 6 characteristics that almost every single piece of art made during the Renaissance has. Realism and expressionism, perspective, classicism, emphasis on individualism, geometrical arrangement of figures, and then light shadowing, and soft edges. We're going to go into each of these specifically. So realism and expressionism. So realism is showing scenes as they actually appear in reality. So this was new. They often idealized figures before this. Didn't really show like true emotion. Expressionism is showing that emotion expressions that match the scene. So these are often depicted in biblical scenes, including the first nude painting since antiquity. So here are some examples. So this is the expulsion from the garden by Masaccio from 1427. So this is Adam and Eve being escorted out of the Garden of Eden. So prior to the Renaissance, you would not have been able to show them nude. You also wouldn't have shown them with those pained expressions on their faces. So that is where we see the realism and their expressionism. And so we have a realistic depiction of human anatomy, would have been a no-no before, and the expressionism is in those painful expressions on their faces, the shame of being expelled from the garden. Perspective. So this is that graphic system that creates the illusion of depth and volume on a flat surface. So there's always a vanishing point that is used to where all the points in the painting recede. So if we look at this, this is a painting called The Trinity, another by Masaccio from 1427. How can we tell that this area has depth? So we see behind here, we can tell that there is recession. There is an area behind the body of Christ. So it has a vanishing point. And where is that vanishing point? It's towards this figure behind Jesus. Everything is receding to that point right there. Classicism. So this is the renewed importance of the arts and influence of ancient Greece and Rome. So the important elements include a classic pose, we'll see that here in a second, and emphasize the perfect proportions of the human body. We also have secularism. So there are paintings that are happening without religious influence. The most famous paintings from the Renaissance are still religious. That's because the Catholic Church was a big patron. They were paying for lots of art. But there were still secular paintings happening for the first time, like you were paying to get family portraits done. Humanism emphasizes the reason and scientific inquiry. So again, focusing on that intellectualism that your mind can figure things out. Individualism, freestanding human form in the S curve or the classic pose. We're going to see that here in a second. So this is the statue of David by Michelangelo from 1501. So what elements of classicism do we see here? We see the perfect proportions. He's the ideal nude figure at this time. He's in the S curve. Notice he's got that slight tilt to his hips. So prior to the Renaissance, all sculptures that were happening, they were standing straight up and down because sculptors hadn't quite figured out how to shift weight. So now they've figured out the engineering, the science of being able to have a figure shift without the statue toppling over. Individualism, highlighting specific characteristics to show how one subject is unique from another. So if we look at this painting, this is a painting of a husband and wife, Battista Sforza e Federico de Montefeltro, by Piero della Francesca from 1465. So prior to this, paintings weren't really accurate of people. They didn't really show, it was, they all kind of looked identical, and they could tell them apart only by their clothes or their jewelry. So now artists are really focusing on getting those human features accurate, so you can tell the difference between people in the paintings that they're paying for. Okay, so everything about these two people is different. Their complexions, their bone structure, their clothing, the directions they're facing, everything is different. Geometrical arrangement of figures. This is the arrangement of figures to form geometric shapes. Different shapes are going to symbolize different things. So we're often going to see in Renaissance art the arrangement of things into triangles to represent the Holy Trinity. If we look at this painting of the Madonna, so this is by Da Vinci in 1467, you can see we have the triangle with Madonna and baby, and then we also have the rectangles in the background of the windows. Light and shadowing and softening of edges. So these are two terms that we're going to be talking about a lot throughout this unit. So sfumato is the blurring or softening of sharp outlines by gradually blending one tone into another. So this means smoky in Italian. So it's just kind of a gradual blending between two things. And then chiaroscuro is the use of extreme contrast between light and dark. Okay, so it's a dramatic effect. So sfumato is a gradual blending, chiaroscuro is a contrast. So we'll see that here in this painting. So this is Ginevra da Vinci by Leonardo da Vinci in 1474. So you can see sfumato, that gradual blending, when we see the blending of the tree background in her hair and the black collar on her neck. And then we see the chiaroscuro, the stark light and dark contrast from her skin tone to the black on her dress. All right, so we're going to look at this painting again. This is another Madonna and Child. This one is by Leonardo da Vinci from 1490. Where do we see those 6 characteristics? So we see that geometric arrangement of shapes into the Trinity. We see they clearly have different facial features, the individualism. They each have different expressions on their face. We see the perspective and that we can tell there is a background behind her. We have the classicism with the importance of the past shown here with this historical painting, all kinds of things that you could talk about in your notes.